The studio lights were hotter than Barron expected, a flat, unforgiving brightness that erased shadows and magnified every movement. From his chair, the set felt smaller than it had during rehearsal, the air dense with the faint hum of cameras and the quiet shuffle of producers behind glass. He sat upright, shoulders squared the way he'd been coached, hands folded neatly in his lap. This was supposed to be controlled, predictable, a conversation about civic engagement, youth perspectives, and what it meant to grow up under a microscope. Nothing he hadn't rehearsed. Jasmine Crockett waited until the pleasantries passed. Her posture was relaxed, almost conversational, but there was a precision to the way she leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the desk. When she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She framed her words as questions, clean, deliberate, impossible to mistake for casual curiosity. She referenced timelines, old interviews, archived statements that most viewers would never think to connect. Each detail landed softly, but together they formed a pattern that hung in the air like a half-finished sentence. Barron felt it before he fully understood it. A subtle shift in the room. The host's smile tightened. One of the producers stopped writing notes. The conversation, which had been drifting comfortably, suddenly snapped into focus. Jasmine wasn't accusing anyone of a crime or calling anyone a liar. She was doing something more unsettling, placing two versions of the same story side by side and letting the gap speak for itself. Barron blinked. Once, twice. His rehearsed smile faltered, just enough for the camera to catch the crack. He told himself to breathe. This was fine. He'd been trained for moments like this, warned that questions could turn sharp without warning. Still, the specifics caught him off guard. He hadn't expected names, dates, and quotes delivered so calmly, so publicly. He shifted in his seat, feeling the heat creep up his neck. He opened his mouth to answer, then paused, recalibrating. The words came out faster than he intended, a rush of context and qualifiers that tumbled over one another. He tried to frame the family narrative the way he'd always heard it, carefully, respectfully, but Jasmine listened without interrupting, her expression steady. When he finished, she nodded once and followed up, gently, asking him to clarify a detail he'd glossed over. That was when his foot started tapping. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that he noticed it himself and tried, unsuccessfully, to stop. He reached for the glass of water beside him, fingers brushing the rim before knocking it slightly. The clink echoed louder than it should have. He laughed, short, sharp, too loud, then cut himself off, realizing how it sounded. The audience shifted in their seats. Somewhere off camera, someone cleared their throat. Jasmine adjusted her papers, not as a threat, but as a signal that she was prepared. She referenced a clip that contradicted the explanation he'd just given, not triumphantly, but thoughtfully, as if inviting him to help resolve the discrepancy. Her tone stayed even, almost sympathetic. "Help me understand," she said, and somehow that was worse than an outright challenge. Barron felt his pulse in his ears. He glanced briefly toward the host, then back at Jasmine, aware that every flicker of his eyes was being captured, streamed, clipped, and shared in real time. He could almost see the comments forming online, the headlines writing themselves. He straightened his jacket, buying time, and tried again, this time slower, more carefully. But the more he spoke, the more he realized how thin his certainty felt. Some of the answers he'd inherited no longer fit neatly with the questions now being asked. The murmurs from the studio audience grew louder, not hostile, just curious. Phones buzzed silently in pockets as notifications lit up across the internet. Producers exchanged looks. This wasn't going according to the rundown. Jasmine noticed the tension but didn't exploit it. Instead, she pressed once more, her question simple, almost disarming, aimed not at scandal but at accountability. Barron paused. For a long second, he said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and unmistakable, filling the studio and spilling into living rooms everywhere. In that moment, the pressure wasn't just about his family's past, it was about whether he could navigate the space between loyalty and truth without losing himself on live television. The commercial break ended, but the tension didn't dissolve with the music's sting. If anything, it sharpened. Barron stood just offset, pacing a narrow strip of carpet, counting his steps without meaning to. An aide murmured reassurance, another whispered strategy, but the words slid past him. What stayed was the echo of that silence, the one that had swallowed the studio whole, and the realization that whatever came next would define the moment far more than anything already said. When the red light blinked back on, the host offered a careful re-entry, thanking everyone for staying with the conversation. Jasmine turned first, not with a gotcha, but with an acknowledgement. She spoke about pressure, about growing up with a name that precedes you into every room, about how easy it is for narratives to harden before the people living inside them have a chance to shape their own words. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a retreat. It was an invitation. Barron felt his shoulders drop a fraction. He took a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. This time, he didn't reach for polish. He didn't try to smooth the edges. He admitted, plainly, that some of what he'd repeated over the years came from habit more than understanding. He spoke about hearing the same explanations so often they became muscle memory, about how questioning them sometimes felt like betrayal, even when the questions were reasonable. The room changed again, but differently now. The audience quieted, not with anticipation, but attention. Jasmine listened, nodding, letting the space belong to him. When she asked her next question, it wasn't about timelines or clips. It was about how he navigated the gap between loyalty and independence, between protecting family and forming his own voice. Barron answered slowly. He talked about the loneliness of being seen but not known, about how people projected intentions onto him before he'd finished a sentence. He acknowledged the privilege that came with his last name without pretending it erased the strain. His voice wavered once, then steadied. He didn't ask for sympathy. He asked for room to grow. The host glanced toward the control room, sensing the shift, and let the conversation breathe. Jasmine followed with a reminder that transparency doesn't have to mean exposure, that choosing honesty can be an act of respect, not rebellion. She emphasized that accountability isn't a verdict, it's a process. Barron nodded, eyes bright, absorbing the reframing like a lifeline. Online, the clip took on a second life. The earlier shock morphed into debate, then reflection. Commentators paused mid-takedown to reconsider. Viewers argued not about who had won, but about what it looked like to watch someone choose vulnerability under pressure. The narrative split, but it deepened. As the segment wrapped, the host thanked both guests for staying present through discomfort. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, it was thoughtful. Barron stood, shook hands, and for a moment lingered, exchanging a few quiet words with Jasmine off mic. Whatever was said didn't matter as much as the fact that it happened, unscripted, human, unfinished. Backstage, the noise returned in a rush. Phones rang, messages stacked up, advisors offered spin. Barron listened politely, then asked for a minute alone. He sat on a folding chair, hands clasped, replaying the moment he'd paused on air. The silence hadn't broken him, he realized. It had given him a choice. When he finally stepped outside, the evening air felt cooler, real. He pulled his jacket tighter and glanced once at his reflection in the glass, older than he'd been that morning, not hardened, just clearer. The story would keep circulating, reshaped by headlines and hot takes, but the core of it was his now. In living rooms and comment sections, people leaned closer to their screens, not because they'd witnessed a scandal, but because they'd seen something rarer, a live reckoning that didn't end with a mic drop. It ended with a question left open, and the sense that, the next time the lights came on, the answer might sound different.